France officially decolonized Africa in the 50s and 60s, though some say they still participate in colonialism there today. This is through exploiting their labor for mines and plantations, scamming African nations of their money through the use of the CFA franc, or who knows, maybe just straight up assassinating African leaders for not being corrupt for France. But what if France was more open about colonization? What if France never decolonized? Now, some questions might arise as to how this would happen. This was a time in which the USA and the USSR were both demanding decolonization. France really needed US money to rebuild their economy because it kind of got destroyed in World War II. And the United States might not want to give money to a country openly disobeying them. But let's just say in this timeline, the United States is scared off from the idea of decolonization after seeing communists gain popularity in an already decolonized land named Vietnam. So they see this and decide maybe keeping large parts of Africa with France and Portugal might not be that bad an idea. So France and Portugal in this timeline do not decolonize, and apartheid South Africa is not in any direct threat. Now for some backstory as to how colonization by France began in Africa in the first place. Around Senegal in West Africa, the French began to establish trading posts along the coast in 1624. The two main ones were Gorée and Saint Louis. In 1664, the French East India Company was established, and they made a few forts along the African coast. While the Ottoman Empire was weak in 1830, the French seized Algiers and began the first real colonization of Africa by Europeans. And in 1884, the Berlin Conference began, and France gained a lot of territory in Africa, which lasted till the 60s. So our point of departure will be 1956. It is 1956, and the United States supports France's colonial ambition in Africa at the United Nations, after the independence of Morocco, Ghana, and Tunisia, of course. The rest of NATO reluctantly follows. As a quote-unquote compromise with the local African elites, who, by the way, were fans of France, the French would adopt something similar to the British Dominion system, on paper at least, because the British dominions were very free, but these quote-unquote dominions would be way less free. Any elections held in the colonial African republics would be heavily unfair, as separatist parties who would definitely win every election would not be allowed to participate. The French military would be stationed in the republics at all times, and last but certainly not least, these new republics would be very dependent on France for their economies to function. In other words, nothing has changed, except now they have a UN seat. Now you might think, you mentioned the colonial African republics a lot in that last bit, but what do they look like on a map? Well, here you go. As you can see, there are two republics. The Indian Ocean Isles and northern Algeria are incorporated into France proper. The incorporations are because the Indian Ocean Isles are good navy bases, and northern Algeria is because Algeria was already incorporated into France in our timeline due to it being 13% French and being under French rule for so long. South Algeria is omitted from France for reasons we will go over later. Now you might think, these two republics are way too massive and will never be stable and strong, and that is precisely why France would make them like that. Plus, that's what most of former French Africa is in our timeline anyways. In 1956, the two colonial republics, French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa, are established. First and foremost, France would encourage settlement by the French into Africa, mainly in Algeria. This would be so that Algeria would be majority French and would be seen as a valid part of France like they saw it. Plus, in any scenario which they gotta decolonize, Algeria would remain part of France if it was majority French. France would spend a lot of money developing northern Algeria and promoting it as a good place to settle, and this would attract many poor people to move there from France. As I had said before, southern Algeria would be ceded to West Africa as an autonomous zone. This would be because to achieve Algeria becoming majority French faster, the French authority would expel a bunch of native Algerian Arabs from the north. They would be moved to southern Algeria. The influx of northern Algerians to Berber country in the south would cause a lot of conflict in the area, therefore more instability. Through the Cold War, the USSR would try to support revolutions in French Africa. Large swaths of the two republics would be consistently in the hands of communist rebels. The majority of Africans in this timeline would support the USSR and communism, due to them being seen as liberators trying to free Africa from France. The Sahara and Lake Chad regions would be pretty much independent, as the French would have no way to exert influence there. That and consistently being in the hands of communist rebels. The communist rebels would hold their ground due to Soviet aid, holding major cities like Timbuktu and Gao, but by 1989 the Soviets would stop aiding them due to economic issues back home, and their line would crumble. They would be beaten back all the way to Lake Chad. In our timeline, when the USSR collapsed and communism was no longer an issue, apartheid South Africa also collapsed. Same thing would happen with French Africa in this timeline. As South Africa would crumble in 1994, a major French ally would be gone, and France would be even more isolated. And back in 1993, the US would for the first time denounce French colonialism. So, in 1996, the process of decolonization would start. As you can see, northern Algeria and the Indian Ocean Isles stay French. The Indian Ocean Isles are still French in our world, so don't see why that would change. And by the late 70s, early 80s, Algeria, at least the northern bit, would be majority French, so that would stay as well. Now we will summarize some of the social shifts that would occur in this world. 1. In the new nations of the Moyen Congo, modern-day Gabon and the Republic of Congo, and Senegal, support of French rule and French in general would be high because they would be comparatively rich and developed to the rest of Africa. This would be because of since these nations were the political centers of the French African republics, they would benefit greatly from the exploitation and the French officials that would settle there. The rest of Africa would not quite be such fans of France. And quite frankly, the entire world wouldn't, especially because of what they did in Algeria. Number 2, speaking of Algeria, Algeria is divided. North Algeria, which would have been majority French by the early 80s due to expulsions of Algerians to the south, high rates of French settlement, and policies to stagnate the Algerian birth rates. North Algeria would be a full part of France too, like Corsica. And when South Algeria gained full independence in the 90s, many of the remaining Algerians in the north would move to the south and solidify North Algeria as French. This obviously disgusts pretty much everyone, and many still hope to take back the north one day. Lastly, anything French is seen as bad and oppressive. In pretty much all of the former colonies but the Congo and Senegal, this includes the language, which is discouraged on a national level. Thank you all for watching that very painful video. Now that I'm looking back at it, it's kind of cringe. But I promise I'll get better, and thank you all for watching it. Feel free to leave any criticism. I'm always open for criticism on my videos. See you guys later.